I do not like this Katrina analogy.
This was Barack Obama's Hurricane Katrina.
It doesn't make sense to compare this to a natural disaster.
President Obama's Katrina.
It's a Katrina moment, right?
So I hope this doesn't become the Katrina moment for President Obama.
Hurricane Sandy brought much of the Northeast to a standstill. This is starting to look like, in my opinion, Obama's Katrina.
BP's spill is President Obama's Katrina.
Or the largest oil spill in our nation's history. While some say this could be President Obama's Katrina.
And the award for false equivalency of the year goes to... I knew it! The idea that the rollout of Obamacare is Obama's Katrina moment.
When the President of the United States asks Congress to confirm almost $4 million to spend, it would make many believe there is some definitive action coming. After all, that much money has to be able to make a real difference in whatever form it's being spent. Right? But the President's request for those funds in relation to the current immigration crisis are raising a tremendous amount of eyebrows. They are gripping this country right now, a country that has more than a few on both sides of the aisle up in arms. For closer examination reveals it's not all about protecting America, but perhaps pandering to a current and future voter base. Explanations and discussion all around. Welcome into MidPoint. The executive editor of the Washington Examiner, Mark Tapscott, joins us again from D.C. Mark, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
Mark, I wanted you to first comment on what we just heard, a number of sound bites, because it seems as if Obama's Katrina is now the catchphrase around the Washington media corps, or at least around the national media corps. Is it a fair analogy in your opinion?
Well, I think it's certainly a very misunderstood analogy, because the problem in the Katrina situation for George Bush was not the hurricane per se, but the inability seeming at the time of the federal government to respond in an effective way. And in that sense, I think it is a good analogy to what's happening today, where we see a crisis on our border and grave doubts from a lot of folks on both sides of the partisan aisle about the adequacy or lack thereof of what the president is doing, if anything.
Well, that, I guess, comes to the next point here. Can you give us a feel in Washington, D.C., what it is like and what is being said about what is termed the president's complete disregard for concern about this? I take us now back to last week in Denver, where he's seen playing pool with Colorado Governor Hickenlooper, basically not going to the border. Right. There's a lot of people saying that this is just a president who is so completely out of touch that he doesn't care about his own people. But then again, at the same point, you have to ask why. He obviously sees this. He knows what people are saying. He knows what people are seeing here. So how can anybody be this completely, to use the phraseology and make it simple, clueless?
That is exactly the question, I think, that is on the minds of many people here in Washington, D.C. The Washington Post, which is very much the voice of the Washington establishment, if you will, has a very interesting article yesterday, I believe, on the front page that basically asks the question or poses the possibility that the immigration issue, the political dynamics of it are changing because of this immigration crisis and changing in a way that I suspect nobody in the Obama White House expected it to. It's changing the context of the debate in order to make the question of border security, everybody can see, I mean, it's right here on our television screens, that border security has to be the first priority before anything else is done. And yet that's exactly the point on which the president refuses to act. So it is a very, very strange atmosphere here, because it doesn't lend itself to an understandable, if you will, explanation, easy explanation.
Is it fair to say then that when we look at this almost $4 billion that the president is asking for, $1.8 billion goes to the Department of Health and Human Services for the care of unaccompanied children, including shelter and medical care, plus then, if you go to the other side of this, $64 million to the Department of Justice, much of this money to be spent on hiring 40 additional teams of immigration judges.
Right.
Is it fair to say that if you were to go around Washington and kind of get to some of the insiders here who don't always want their names to be used in comments, that even they would say this bill completely smacks, this request rather, completely smacks of doing nothing more than to try and create a palm frond, if you will, a hand to the to the community here to not only get to Hispanic American voters today, but to create the next generation of Hispanic American voters, that it seems to be planned.
Well, I don't know if you can say that it's people here are assuming that it's planned. I'm sure there are a lot of people who do think that that's probably the case. The significant thing to me is that when you look at the details of the bill, the $4 billion that the president has requested, virtually none of it, there is a very small portion of it, but a very small portion that would actually, you could argue, say, help strengthen the border or restore border security. But the vast majority of the funds are going to be spent taking care of and frankly providing legal defenses to these folks that have come over into the country illegally. You know, nobody wants to see children suffer, but the assumption that appears to govern how this particular request was put together was that this is more or less the new normal, if you will, and therefore we have to simply find ways to cope with it rather than seeking to find ways to stop the problem.
Mark, what is next is what America really wants to know, because it is obvious that this bill is going to be, this request, I keep calling it a bill, I want to go back to just calling it the request for money here, that this request is going to be looked at by Congress. It's not going to happen in 24 hours. It won't happen in 24 days, perhaps. It may not happen in months. So what exactly is the thinking process in Washington, and what can happen in a short period of time to try and at least stem the tide of what's happening here, to at least slow it down?
Well, I'm not so sure that it won't pass, and perhaps even in a reasonably short period of time. And here's why I say that. Washington has this tremendous capacity for figuring out how to use a bill to accomplish all manner of purposes that don't really have anything at all to do with the stated purpose of it. And there's already been talk that there will be offers from the White House, unofficially of course, through the usual back channels in Congress, to in effect turn this into a Christmas tree where in effect you buy votes of people who would otherwise be inclined to vote against it. And I think that's probably what's going to happen because the White House political strategists, I'm sure they realize that's probably the only way they're going to get any kind of a bill through. And if that's what it takes, you know, they're not particularly worried about spending more money if that's what it takes, as long as they get the money that they're looking for their reasons. So I think we will see something pass Congress. I don't think it'll happen this week, maybe next week.
We've heard in recent weeks a number of Democrats that have gone against the president, have spoken out publicly against him. Some of them have been slapped down by the White House very quietly, very nicely. Would it be your understanding that while we've heard a few, that there's a lot more out there who would like to say something but are really keeping their mouth shut at the moment simply because they don't want to be taken to task publicly?
Well, I think you can assume that there have been a lot of phone calls from very worried Democrats, especially those in the House who face re-election, and those who in the Senate, like Mary Landrieu, for example, or Mark Udall in Colorado, who face very, very tough re-election fights, probably saying in very blunt terms, you guys have made a mess here and you better find a way to fix it quick, because if you don't, the whole, as the Washington Post suggested in that story that I alluded to earlier, what is happening is the immigration debate, which has previously been at least perceived to be one that's very favorable to Democrats, is being turned around into one that is very unfavorable to Democrats. And you can bet that the political folks in the White House, they are desperately looking for a way to get this thing settled down, at least to get it off the front page.
We've got about 30 seconds left here. There really is no win, though, for the president. Isn't it fair to say that he has dug a hole so deep here that simply there's very little way to come out of this on a positive sense?
That's perhaps the biggest obstacle in this town to getting things done that need to be done. President Obama, you know, whether you like him or you don't, I think everybody sees now that he is very obstinate once he takes a position. He doesn't like to talk to Congress. He doesn't like to negotiate. And that makes it very difficult to get things done, like addressing the real issues involved here.
Almost impossible indeed. Mark Tapscott from the Washington Examiner. Thanks so much for joining us, Mark. We'll do it again.
My pleasure.
As he said, Washington, a unique place indeed. Check in with the mothership coming up next on the website for the latest breaking news, terrorist bombs, Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, and an American company's involvement in the illegal immigrant death train. And a whole lot more coming up next as we continue right here on MidPoint.